Welcome back to the interview series on the social and economic consequences of disruptive technologies by rethinking economics and now. Today, we'll be focusing on science, technology, and innovation policy, or STI policy, innovation by firms, and development in the context of Latin America, and especially related to disruptive technologies. And for this, 4 world-class experts have been so kind to make time for us today. First with us today is Gabriela Dutrénit, who is an economist with a PhD in Science and Technology Research Studies from the STI-Policies Research Unit in the University of Sussex in the UK. She is also the coordinator of the Master Program in Economics, Management and Policies of Innovation, and the related areas of PhD Social Science Program at the Universidad Metropolitana in Mexico. She is a regular member of the Mexican Academy of Science and a coordinator of LALIX, Latin American Network for Economics of Learning, Innovation and Competence Building Systems, the Latin American chapter of GlobalX. From 2012-2014, she was also the coordinator of the Scientific and Technological Advisory Forum in Mexico. She has coordinated several evaluations of Mexican policy of science, technology, innovation, or STI. Secondly, with us today is Gillian Marcelle, who has served as a tenured associate professor of strategy and innovation at the Wits Business School, Wits University in Johannesburg, South Africa. She was awarded a PhD, also from the Science Policy Research Unit of the University of Sussex, where she has also been a visiting research fellow. She has also been a visiting scholar at the Stata Center for Technology and Design, based at MIT, where she continues to be an affiliated researcher. Dr. Marcelle is currently the managing member of Resilience Capital Ventures, an advisory firm in the blended finance space, where she has been successful in capital raising for private equity funds, deal origination, and guiding the business activities of commercial startups and social ventures. She has researched and advocated for racial justice, gender equity, and accountability in the technology and international development sector, related to which she has also advised the United Nations. Thirdly, with us today is Beatriz Fialho, an innovation management specialist and an executive advisor responsible for strategic studies at Bio-Manguinhos, the largest Brazilian public biopharmaceutical laboratory. Previously, she also worked there as the head of budget and strategic planning and as a project manager for the building and implementation of Bio-Manguinhos, a new site in Sierra, the plant-based technology center. She received her PhD in Innovation Management and Development from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, where she previously worked as a research analyst. During her PhD, she was also a pre-doctoral fellow at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, working with Calestous Juma. Lastly with us today is Jigar Bhatt, who is an independent scholar and development practitioner. He received his PhD from Columbia University and a Master's in International Development and Regional Planning from MIT. He studies the relationship between knowledge, power, and the state, especially the influence of economic expertise or social and built environment. Jigar has also a decade of experience working on sustainable infrastructure development for food and water security. He was also a senior program officer at the US Millennium Challenge Corporation and as a consultant for the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, the World Food Programme, World Bank, and WaterAid. He also volunteers with a group that alleviate heterodox thinking to address inequality. Elevate, of course, heterodox thinking to address inequality and ecological decline. And with that, I would love to go to the first question for Gabriela. So far in this interview series, we have not really had a chance to go into science, technology, innovation, or STI policies. I was therefore hoping you could tell us a bit more on what exactly STI policies are and how is this policy being implemented in Mexico and other Latin American countries. I think you're still mute.
So, let me start with knowledge. We are living in times where knowledge is at the base of the progress of society. For instance, improving the living condition, finding solutions to diseases like COVID, improving material for clothing, etc. But there is another side of the knowledge, no? So sometimes knowledge also induces changes that are not moving in the right direction. For instance, the increase of inequality in the access to the benefits of growth, negative effects on the environment, which are so reflected in the global warming, and also many threats to biodiversity. And then science, technology, and innovation is a set of activities related to the process of generation, acquisition, and diffusion of knowledge. And which are the actors of the science, technology, and innovation activity? Well, you have individuals and organizations. Organizations like universities, research centers, R&D labs, business enterprises in any sector, but also government, different agencies of the government, the Congress, the financial sector, many organizations. And you have also individuals who actually develop these science, technology, and innovation activities. You have researchers, academicians in general, employees or engineers or R&D directors of in firms or firms officials, not deputies, of course, as well. And all these actors are connected in what we call innovation systems, which operate at local level, at regional level, at national level. No? And this innovation system that connect all these actors, they contribute to economic change in general, and in the case that we are interested on, they contribute to the development process in our countries. No? But you have these science, technology, and innovation activities, but there are a lot of failures in the market, failures in the systems that justify the intervention of the government in these activities. You have, for instance, imperfect appropriability of different goods, because, for instance, firms they carry out R&D activities, but the firm cannot appropriate of all the results related to the knowledge that is generated by their activities, so that the firm prefer not to carry out some and invest in some activities, in some research and development activity, because they are not going to appropriate of all the results. So the government has to intervene in this science, technology, and innovation sector, and the government do that through the science, technology, and innovation policies. And these policies, they define an agenda, they have a set of objectives, and design a set of instruments in order to stimulate specific science, technology, and innovation activities. For instance, now that we have the problem of the COVID, and then the government has to intervene in order to fund, for instance, the development of new vaccines and the production also of the vaccines and the ventilators, etc. No? So all these activities, the science, technology, and innovation policy, and the activities that are stimulated by these policies, well, they are connected with what is called the government and the governance of the innovation system. O sea, how the government organize this to be the rector of these science, technology, and innovation activities. And then today, science, technology, and innovation policy has to be a public policy. It means there is a public problem, like the COVID, for instance, and then the science, technology, and innovation public policy has to focus in these public problems like the COVID, but many others. For instance, in Mexico, we have a lot of people with diabetes. So diabetes is a health problem in Mexico who has increased the problem related with the diabetes. So this is a public problems, and the government has to intervene through the science, technology, and innovation policy, and through the health policies and other arenas. No? And then how is the government organized? Well, it means, for instance, in some countries you have ministries of science, technology, and innovation. In other countries, you have a council, general council of science and technology. See, and a public policy, it means not only that the policy focus on a public problem, but also it means that it has to be public participation in the decisions and in the design of this, in this case, science, technology, and innovation policy. It means that the stakeholders or all the people related with this science, technology, and innovation activities, well, they have to express their voices, they have to express opinions, and participate in some way in the design of science, technology, and innovation policy. And so this is the broad framework in which the science, technology, and innovation policies are located. And as we have science, technology, and innovation public policy, you have also health public policy or labor public policy. And this idea of the participation of the stakeholders or the beneficiaries of these policies is important in order to build public policy in any sector. We are talking now about science, technology, and innovation sector.
I think that's really interesting. It really shows the importance of having such an holistic and a more broad understanding of agents in the market. Gillian, if I may ask, how does this relate to your work, or for instance, especially on innovation and the learning school? And could you also tell us more on the importance of how we define innovation for this process?
Thank you so much. And thank you, Gabriela, because you started, in fact, with the most important word, which is knowledge. And so my own work on innovation actually challenges the discipline of innovation studies to center knowledge and to center all forms of knowledge as opposed to science and technological knowledge. And this is particularly true because we've sort of inherited and not critiqued the accepted versions and definitions of innovation that we've inherited essentially from Western Europe, where the notion of an inventor in a lab still is the expressed form of thinking about innovation. Whereas even in advanced economies, that form of practice for innovation only describes a fraction of how innovation actually takes place. But the myth of the sole inventor sort of is preserved. And so over a very long period of time, because I'm actually taking on the antecedents and the dominant thinking in innovation studies as a discipline, I have provided a definition of innovation which takes knowledge as being at the center and emphasizes the processes in which innovation actually takes place. And so I define innovation as a process of generating knowledge, processing it, distributing it, and emphasizing that the forms of knowledge in the innovation system must extend to non-technological knowledge as well as technological knowledge. Why that is important is that competing, challenging, disruptive definition of innovation describes innovation as it is performed by the global majority. So that definition is actually more accurate from an inductive point of view for describing what is performed as innovation, as problem solving for the global majority. But it also defines how innovation is performed in so-called advanced economies where technological novelty is not actually the driving force of innovation. And so the implications of this for the architecture that Gabriela defined is that in many instances, that architecture renders invisible innovation performance because that architecture speaks about a science and technology system, which is the formal lab-based technological system through which a fraction of innovation actually takes place, but renders invisible the innovation as it is performed in firms, by individuals, on farms, and by individuals. And so what this means is that it renders innovation as something that is for the elite. And so we keep having to then do the work of making science, technology, and innovation policy and innovation mean something for most people in an economy or in a society, as opposed to starting with where most people are. Because if you started where most people are, then you wouldn't have to keep trying to make it relevant. You would actually start with meaning as the first point of intervention and the first point of analysis and the first point of discussion. And so as a challenger, as one scholar who's coming up with these ideas about how we should reimagine innovation, this work is what I based my scholarly activity around. But it is also what I am using to do other kinds of work now that I am in transactional finance, because innovation takes place in every sector. As Gabriela said, when you're speaking about public policy for various sectors. And so now that I'm operating in the finance and investment world, I'm thinking about what are the processes of innovation that take place in that sector. And now, obviously, that would not be a public policy problem for the STI and policy sector. It would be a problem or a challenge for finance and investment itself, because finance and investment and other sectors are also leaving out the performers of innovation, the intended beneficiaries of innovation, and particularly what I'm interested in, if we're speaking now about disruptive technologies and AI and so on. Our notion of innovation centers a small fraction of the world. And so when we speak about disruptive technologies and we imagine who is actually developing these disruptive technologies, because we have the myth of novelty, because we have the constraint of thinking about innovation as science and technology based, it means that we are only thinking about a fraction of the development process. And we continue with a colonial frame to imagine that we can have technologies developed in New York and Silicon Valley and then applied as though by magic for the global majority. And of course, that doesn't work. There is no appropriation, there is no benefit, and we have our government sort of trying to hop into action to catch up. So I'll leave it there for now, but this is already a very interesting discussion. So thanks for Gabby for starting us off.
I think that gives a great material indeed for discussion. Beatriz, I was very curious, how does this relate to your work on, for instance, innovation management, and especially relating to disruptive technologies as the Internet of Things?
Well, I started early in my career on the academic side, studying innovation, studying R&D management, and so on. And then I make a kind of major change, and then go to the productive sector to see actually how things work there. If I was an economist, if I wanted to be an economist, I should really taste what is actually the real world I was studying and talking about. And then I began working at Bio-Manguinhos, and when I started working there, something that already bothered me when on the academic side was this idea that innovation is only valuable if it's disruptive, if it's radical, if it's outside of the box, whatever does that mean. I'm not even discussing what is out of the box. But most of the management theories that comes to developing world, for example, they are developed and thought in quite different world. And then we bring this to our companies, to our institutions, as it's a gold standard from where we should start. And this relates to innovation as not a panacea, but as the main reason for everything. And you should focus on disruptive, on radical, on future technologies, and more than the state of the art. And then I started working on foresight, strategic planning, and currently I am responsible for foresight at Bio-Manguinhos. And when I started working with the group, my mantra is actually this: if you are working on innovation, you have to deal with uncertainty, with bounded rationality, and most of all, that we don't know what we don't know. And this is quite disturbing, because when you realize that you are in constant change and the world is changing constantly, even if you cannot see the change is there. And change does not belong to a particular point of view. It does not belong to the US or to European countries. It belongs to anyone. So it depends. When you talk about disruptive technologies like Internet of Things, or like modern biotechnology was in the 80s and so on, it depends from where is your standpoint. With which glasses are you looking at innovation? With which glasses are you looking at disruptiveness? And what for? And generally, when you go to the organizations, it's just like a mantra: to innovate, you have to invest in radical innovations no matter what. And then a lot of things you lose in this process. When you ask about IoT or industry 4.0 or 5.0 or 6.0, it doesn't matter which number it is. It depends actually on how you look to change and the way you in your country or your organization navigate so far. What is your background? What is your history? You have to understand your environment. You have to understand your market and how it works, instead of focusing on market failures or system failures that describe developed countries, but not failures. If I don't like much this idea of market failures or system failures, but anyway, but how is that in your developing countries? What's your history? What's your process? And then most of the time, people ignore that you have learning curves. People ignore that disruption is not that a big deal. And then we come to something that I studied before I entered the non-academic world. How is your evolutionary reasoning? How do you deal with cumulativization? How, from Veblen? How do you work on dialectics, from Marx? Those concepts cannot be taken for granted. So you have to think about that. And most of the time, people on the organizational side, they just buy some theories, they just buy some models, and boom, they have to work. And when they don't work, who is to blame? So this, it bothers me when I'm talking about Internet of Things. Is that really disruptive? Is that the big issue to IoT, is or is not disruptive? But what changes it will imply to developing countries or developed countries or class relations and so on. So not focus too much on the nature of the technology, but what it brings to us. This is what I try to discuss more, not only internally, but also with other colleagues. Thank you.
It was really, really interesting. I think it really challenges many preconceptions which you hold when you start here. Jigar, I was very curious. It seems that this also is very important related to or accepted economic knowledge, that this is also an element here. So how, considering your research on this, how does or what we accept as economic expertise shape or social and built environment? Could you expand on that? I think you're still on mute. Yeah.
practice. So thanks a lot. This is really engaging discussion. I am going to touch directly on some of the things that Gabriela and Gillian and Beatrice brought up about bringing everyone, having everyone involved in the idea of innovation, and also where innovation happens. And how people adopt it. Some of the research I've done on the informal economy. And so there is a sort of general sense in mainstream economics, and that's changing, is that informality is something to be reduced over time. Things need to be formalized, right? And then you also get the idea that knowledge exists out there and can be adopted. It's exogenous, can be adopted by people. And usually people in the informal economy are ones in which knowledge is imposed upon. They are the adopters, not the creators. And so there are, I think, the idea that the informal economy can be a sort of a font, a source of knowledge is not accepted widely in mainstream economics, but I think increasingly should be. I know that Beatrice has touched on the pharmaceutical industry. There is this whole idea of bioprospecting. You have numbers of millions of people in the informal rural economy finding plants and herbs and things that go directly into innovative pharmaceutical processes, but don't get credit, certainly don't get the monetary rewards always, the value's not transferred, certainly don't get the citation credit of that work. In my own work, some interesting things among water entrepreneurs in Maputo, Mozambique, is you would find that they were innovating better, in some cases adapting better to the local environment than the large-scale main utility was. I'm not suggesting that informal water providers are the sort of silver bullet solution to water supply. I think utilities have a lot to offer, and that continues to be a really a good approach. But we can't ignore the type of innovation that these entrepreneurs are doing in terms of efficiency with metering. They would make some economists blush in terms of how they made profits and how they saved money and judicious use of labor and equity. They served people with local solutions such as standpipes with affordable water for people who carried so-called jerry cans on their head. These jugs that I myself could not lift on their head, and then basically provided a sort of dual network, one for their poorer neighbors and one for the wealthier neighbors. Things that the utility and the good engineers in Maputo just really hadn't thought of and wouldn't have expected to find, I think, in that sector. There are other examples of barefoot geologists, for example. They're called barefoot geologists. I mean, people that go around and know where mineral deposits are, whereas some large mining companies may not know that they exist and rarely get the credit for. And then a friend of mine, Eric Goldwyn, studied transport networks in New York City and found that it's called dollar vans. The local route drivers knew the better routes and knew the type of payment systems that their clientele would appreciate more than if you came in with a sort of city planner transport model saying this is what your tariff should be, this is the maximizing for in terms of ridership and revenue and financial sustainability, et cetera. So I really want to make the case to students and researchers that the informal economy is not something to be cured. It's not something to be slowly in a sort of I don't know. This may be. I won't go there. But basically, it's not something to be definitively formalized over time. It can coexist. It can be improved. People in the informal economy want to work together in these ecosystems. They want to share knowledge, but they want to be treated more as equals. They want to say, "Hey, we have something to contribute to," and I don't think that's too much to ask. And there's a nice term, Amit Basole, UMass Boston, is someone whose work I follow in this space, and he talks about Lok Vida. It's a Hindi term for the people's knowledge. And this is not just to sort of just to put a postmodern spin on knowledge. This is really valuable knowledge in an economic sense, in an STI sense, that the pharmaceutical companies have figured out, but I think other people need to start figuring out as well. So that's what I want to contribute to.
I think it's really fascinating because it really broadens the discussion that we had before in this series on not just what is classically defined as disruptive technologies, but really that there are different inputs there and different ways of building this. Gillian, I was very curious on how this further relates to your work, but also whether you can talk more about the blended finance framework, especially the bottlenecks for financial innovation in, for instance, disruptive technologies, as to come back to that AI, but also what we discussed earlier.
Thank you so much for that. Well, I in my framing of bottlenecks for financing disruptive technologies, I speak about structural bottlenecks, which might include the fact that you have capital markets that are at varying stages of development. And then you have process bottlenecks in the sense of how do you actually bring in different actors into these capital markets. And then perhaps the most important bottlenecks are the cognitive bottlenecks, which are really some of the things that we've already been discussing, particularly in finance and investment, which is a very homogeneous sector, homogeneous in terms of worldview, homogeneous in terms of racial diversity, homogeneous even in terms of gender. And so you have a sort of an echo chamber in the finance and investment industry, and a system that is very ill-equipped to bring in different forms of understanding of the world. And so what we're finding is that we are not doing well with financing useful technologies, but we're doing really well with financing dating apps, so that you have a complete misallocation of capital. And I don't know how many of you are following the US markets in terms of during COVID, you had a real slide in the financing of ventures that are run by women. And at the same time, you had this incredible surge in the allocation of capital that went to Robinhood, which is one entity. And so you have in 2020 a real sort of laser focus on the ways in which capital markets have misallocated capital. And so the frameworks that I'm developing speak to those kinds of approaches to understanding what are the bottlenecks, what are some of the blind spots that exist, and how can we then redefine or bring in an innovation lens to finance itself to do something about those bottlenecks and blind spots. And I think with AI, it's particularly important because it is a space that requires deep technological understanding. There has been very little effort to demystify the technology. And I do understand that there's some efforts now, and maybe they've been around for some time, but I'm just getting to know them, about speaking about the sort of social and ethical considerations for artificial intelligence. And I think that those things are very important because there's been so much hype. You know, AI is seen as being this thing that once again, without it, developing countries will crash and burn. But when you get to my age, you know that developing countries have been told this about many other kinds of technologies, and we're still here. And so I'm hoping that the leaders in the developing world will sort of ignore the hysteria around the so-called fourth industrial revolution and ask deeper questions. Under what conditions does AI, machine learning, Internet of Things apply, and how can it actually produce a virtuous circle in my conditions, as opposed to believing the hype once again about catching up or never having your well-being and enhanced or poverty reduced.
I think it's really interesting that it's something we hear a lot. Basically, I think also in the Western context, basically there's a lot of hype, but there are some changes, but there's a lot of hype, and it's very important to go through that. And Gabriela, I was very curious, how does this relate to your work on STI policies, and especially in the context of Latin America and Mexico? And what I'm especially curious about is this in the context of how firms learn and accumulate technological capabilities as AI and such.
I think that one point that emerged from the discussion until now is that we are very heterogeneous countries we are between in Latin America. There is a lot of heterogeneity, but also within each country there is a lot of heterogeneity. So the models of science, technology, and innovation policy comes from abroad, comes from the experience of Europe, US, or even from the successful Asian countries. So when these models are implemented in our countries, and so there is a design of the science, technology, and innovation policy in our countries, with so different initial conditions, so these models don't work properly, no? And then this happened with the case of the disruptive technology, because as Beatriz said, well, disruptive technology, there is a discussion around the word, no? The word is, we have the concept of disruptive, if they are disruptive, or we have had disruptive technology, as Beatriz said, over the centuries, actually, the Industrial Revolution and the Second Industrial Revolution, etc., etc. So, yes, definitely, these new technologies are generating disruption, and for that reason, we are talking about the Industry 4.0. But again, we are reproducing this situation that the Latin American countries are confronting these new disruptive technologies with a lot of problems, structural problems in their economies. So when you look at, for instance, the evolution of science, technology, and innovation policies in Latin America, we have followed more or less what has happened at the international level, from the lineal model where science is important, and then there is a development in science, and then in technology, and at the end it reached the market, no? And from the decade of the 2000, we have moved to this more systemic approach of the innovation policies. But all this is connected to the formal settings, that, as was said by Jigar. And then the informal setting is operating in another part of the country. So within one country, you have modern economies and informal settings that are moving much more slowly, and the policies, and particularly the science, technology, and innovation policies, they are focused on these formal settings. But in the informal settings, a lot of things are happening, and the majority of the population are connected with the informal settings, and we don't know how to do with them. Actually, they are reached by the social policies or the labor policies, but not by the science, technology, and innovation policies. And particularly in Latin America or in Africa, you have a lot of this, call it traditional knowledge, which is extremely interesting, that bring a lot of solution for many problems of this part of the society. And this type of knowledge, this traditional knowledge or indigenous knowledge, it is named in different way, this should be connected with this scientific and technological knowledge, but it is not. And this is one of the challenges that we have in our country. But then when you look at the modern part of the economy, something that the theorists of development economics have been working on from the 50s or the 60s, no? These two parts of the economy, no? So in the modern part of the economy, then you have the introduction of this disruptive technology. When I look in Brazil, in Argentina, in Mexico, within the policies, the science, technology, innovation policies, usually there are defined strategic sectors, and these strategic sectors are usually connected with the new technologies in each time. Now, the strategic sectors include the use of artificial intelligence, robotic, Internet of the things, etc. No, but then because with the money that the governments put for promoting these the science, technology, and innovation activities is so limited that even though the introduction of the new technology to be close to the frontier, I would say, no, the amount of money is so limited that we have this strategic sector, but at the end of the day, this top-down, no, from the government and the push that the government do in the science, technology, and innovation activity is extremely limited. So you have a lot of bottom-up activities because, for instance, in the case of Mexico, because our sectors, automobile sector, for instance, is so connected to the global change, no? The value global change, they are connected to the value global change, or whatever is the order of the world, with this large multinational corporation. So obviously in Mexico, the firms that are located in Mexico and are part of this multinational corporation, they are introducing a lot of these new technologies, and then Mexico is one of the main demander of robots all over the world. But it's because this part of the economy is connected to the world. See, and in this sense, these firms that are introducing these new technologies, they are still learning how to introduce the subsidiaries and also the Mexican firms that are supplier of these chains, no? And then they are learning about how to introduce this robot. So they buy the robot, they introduce the robot. This generates a lot of problem with deployment, etc. But this is not the point now, no? But they use the robot, but they don't use, for instance, all the new data that is generated by this robot, you know? And so the introduction of artificial intelligence is much, much slower than the introduction of robots. And then there is a lot of big data that could be used, but it is not used yet because the firm hasn't learned enough to introduce this artificial intelligence. So they need to build more the capability, the technological capabilities that they have in order to use a much more efficient use of these new technologies. And on the informal setting, they don't know what you are talking about the robot that are also included in Amazon, which is sending so many products even in Mexico and even for the informal settings. Yeah.
Jigar, especially the beginning of Gabriela's answer seemed to me very interestingly related to your experience working in sustainable infrastructure development for food and water security. Could you expand on that, or how are you seeing that?
Well, I followed, I don't forget the exact beginning of Gabriela's comments, but in terms of water, you know, it was directed at me, is that right? Did I hear correctly? Okay.
Yes, yeah.
So being the water, I'd already described that there's sort of a standard approach to, it's called the modern infrastructure ideal that comes down from North America mostly, because there were significant gains made. In the book Sanitary City, we talk about how the municipalization movement had achieved widespread coverage, people's welfare improved significantly, and there's a strong, reasonable desire to emulate that. But as all the participants have pointed out, there are local realities that need to be contended with in a lot of these countries. Sometimes you'll hear from people in the global South themselves stress, why don't we deserve those innovations? Why are you giving us substandard innovations? Some sanitation solutions have been criticized for being sort of I don't dressed down, sort of not exactly the ideal, right? I sympathize with that criticism, but at the same time, there are questions about what objectives you want to have, and again, that's about bringing everyone together to say what does an innovation mean in this context? Who is it going to benefit? but there has been one thing I want to touch on unrelated to that, I think, that hasn't been touched on yet, that I think is something interesting and also does not lend itself to mainstream analysis, is this, because Gabriela mentioned robots and how certain leading sectors become dominant. And I think there is this idea of a natural progression of innovation, that innovation will march along, disruption will occur, and adaptation is necessary. And with respect to robots and Amazon, the deliveries and things she talked about, and how robots sometimes come before AI, is in the US, we had obviously with the political upheaval, a real debate about did we miss something with respect to automation and job loss? But a lot of people in the mainstream community, whether in government, economics, just sort of see as the march of innovation and progress as something that states just need to react to. And what I like to point out is that states are deeply involved in creating a lot of this disruption in ways that one might not immediately think of. So for example, we don't think of space when we think about innovation or locations within the city or urban planning. But if you think about Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I think Gabriela would know, Gillian would know well from her time at MIT, is there are spaces within Cambridge, Massachusetts that serve as innovation hubs for robotics. There are entire teams that work on creating new generations of robots. Local city council members, people within the Massachusetts state government spend money on creating these spaces, investing in this type of innovation, and it's been happening for years. So this is not a natural progress, because you've got people like Bill Gates and others just saying, well, robots are going to come, automation is going to come, disruption is going to happen. What we can do is tax the use of robots. And that's really, I may be mistaken, but that's the extent of the debate that I've seen so far, is the idea to reduce the use of robots, you've got to tax them. That's fine for where we are right now, but or maybe fine for where we are right now, but it's important to know how we got here, and local policies and deliberate decisions to invest in innovation that would displace labor has happened at the local level across cities and innovation hubs. And so that's something that I wanted to point out for people who are looking at this field to consider.
If I could make one comment on that, I think picking up on that point, there is also the tendency for states to compete with each other. So there's no doubt that, underlying the US interest at state level or at national level, the notion that if that investment does not take place in the US, then it would take place in China, and somehow you would have lost the race. And so that competition between China, the US, and Europe to some extent, but much less so, is, I think, at the heart of what explains some of the trends that we're seeing. And that competition, say 35 years ago, was taking place with respect to biotechnology. And I'd love to hear Beatrice's positions on that as well.
Well, let me try to some of the ideas that are coming up right now. Gabriela talked about heterogeneity among developing countries and within those countries, and that should shape policies and so on. Jigar also talked about the importance of the local level, Gabriela about Gillian about learning process and so on. So all of us are almost concerned about one thing: how the object that we study, innovation, development, policies, could actually be for a greater good. How can we better use that knowledge for development challenges, for equality, and so on? So if you start from, we don't have a homogeneous situation among countries, between countries, and within countries. When we look at developing countries, as I said earlier, most countries, when they base their policies on market failures or system failures, they are looking at a different point of view, and not to their actual failures. They are looking to failures with glasses that are not fitted to their reality. This is the main problem. And what we see a lot in developing countries is that most policies is a kind of a road with a bunch of bumps, and you go back and forth. Every 10 years, we have a lot of diagnostics, a lot of works trying to understand what is going on, and you see that from every 10 years. When I was doing my PhD in one of those years, a lot of diagnostics were around the world for developing countries about health, about biodiversity. This was one of the topics that I studied on my PhD. And then what is the issue if you're going to do a parallel with IoT and other new technologies? When you look at biodiversity, like Jigar talked about, biodiversity is there for a long time ago. We don't, us developing countries, Brazil has a large biodiversity, but what do we focus on? On synthetic pharmaceuticals, on biological drugs, not on the knowledge that we have that could solve some health problems. They are not fancy. They won't let you publish in high-rated journals, but will solve many of our problems, for sure. And then we can take a case very particular, not necessarily related to biodiversity, but somehow that is the cannabis. This market for cannabidiol. Cannabis in the 19th century was suffering a lot of prejudice in the US due to Mexicans, because they knew how the plant actually helped people. And for example, Eli Lilly, they had marijuana bottled, but then how you make a standard of that? How you extract that knowledge and forbid everyone else to work on that, period. And then you look at right now the market for cannabis, you can see a lot of large multinational companies patenting on that. We have the first firms, the first companies working on that, Canadian, US, not large multinationals, but if you look at the patent, you will see Merck, you will see Pfizer, you will see a lot of large multinational companies going back to this knowledge that they decided somehow in the 19th century. Let's not talk about it because we cannot appropriate that knowledge for us and ban everybody else from that. And then when you look at developing countries, for example, there are some developing countries that actually bought the idea that cannabis is only for drug trafficking. So then you see US and Canada as the main actors in this area. And we here have a lot of knowledge about that, and we don't use that. And then when we do the parallel with AI, and I believe it was Gabriela talking about global value chains. There is a problem with AI. I was reading a recent book from David Harvey. He was discussing that. And AI might allow some countries to escape from the labor intensive to the capital and knowledge intensive. And as Gillian said about the competition between the US and China, China is doing that move from a more capital intensive, more knowledge intensive. And then when you look at some of the data on global value chains, you will see the change in the pattern of trade. And part of that is actually this dispute over which part of the world will still be labor intensive and which is not. And what can we do? Because artificial intelligence can free a lot of our problems regarding the relation between labor and capital. And actually, we can have a good use of that for equality challenges, for development challenges. Are we really wanting to do that? I'm not sure. Actually, I don't have an answer, Gillian, sorry, but I'm not sure.
So I think that we're almost out of time for the interview, but we always have the same closing question in this interview. We can go slightly over time if possible, but basically so we can go a bit more in depth in that, and also allow you some comments on each other's ideas and thoughts. And the question throughout this interview series for the closing statement is always this: there's one thing you could say to students in economics related to the topics we discussed today. What will that be? And for that, I think we're going to do it the reverse order of the initial question. So first for Jigar.
If there's one thing we could tell students, right? Well, so I study expertise in institutions, mostly government institutions, and as I mentioned, I've done some research on knowledge in the informal economy. But I would close with basically in the spirit of rethinking economics is to really treat knowledge production within the academy as a political process. Don't treat it just as even when you're talking about pioneers within certain fields such as development economics. We think of the Kuhnian approach of sort of a disruption in terms of innovation, right? There's truth to that in many disciplines. Economics, I find, at least in development economics, is much more political based. It's certain researchers are closely aligned with certain political projects in certain places. And it's important for us to trace and examine those as ways to understand how certain economic ideas become dominant and how then they influence, as you said in the introduction, our social and built environment. So I really encourage people, whether they're students or researchers, to keep that as part of their lens. And we've seen as waves of economic disciplines have come and gone, and science and technology studies also looks at the sort of waves in social sciences. It's not the dominant part of that field, but there are people looking at it. Yone is one researcher who looked at the struggle between institutional economics and neoclassical economics in the earlier part of the 20th century. And with respect to pluralism, I think pluralism is a very important goal. We've talked about it a number of times in various respects in this panel about bringing voices in, being inclusive. But I would caution that if we treat this sort of rethinking approach in purely pluralistic terms, we'll have a very strong diversity, everyone will feel included, but neoclassical will continue to dominate. And so we have to think about which principles do we want to draw from these various pluralist disciplines, whether feminist, ecological, and say which ones do we want to bring to the fore to solve our biggest problems. The two biggest problems I see are burgeoning inequality, both within the countries and across the globe, and obviously ecological decline. We have to borrow from economics and other social disciplines wherever we can to make economics more relevant to those two major problems and push out the parts of neoclassical economics that are not really conducive to understanding or analyzing and solving those. So that's what I have to say. Thank you.
Very interesting answer. Beatriz, if here's one thing you could say to students watching today, in especially economics, related to the topics we discussed, what would that be?
I believe that it would be, you should never rest. You don't know what you don't know, and you never know what you don't know, ever. So if you keep that spirit that is not satisfied, even though you can know something, you actually know something, you'll build the knowledge, you will have a knowledge, but if you are satisfied, then it's boring. And when you reach to the boring place, you won't create, you won't challenge, you won't be able to have that spark. Even if you're an academic or if you are on the marketplace that are companies or whatever, in my opinion, when you have a spirit that doesn't rest, then you will always find something that might be different, that you should be more interested, even if it's your own ideas. don't get attached to what you have written in the past or what you have thought in the past. If you keep that in mind, then I think we'll have better economists. If we keep that in mind, always think about, is that so or not? That's it.
I think that's a beautiful answer. Gillian, what will for you be the closing statements in this context? I think you're still mute.
I think it really depends on who we're talking to, but let me assume that we're talking to Dutch economics students. My sense is that the main message that I would want to give to Dutch economic students is that they should embrace the parts of their own history that might be uncomfortable. Because curiosity, which Beatrice spoke about, is really important, as is a focus on the big problems facing the planet, which Jigar spoke about. But countries around the world and societies around the world have different positions vis-a-vis the cause of those problems and where we are located in the solutions for those problems. And I think it's really easy for a Dutch graduate student or in their undergraduate to be very passionate and to have an ethical orientation. And then 30 years later, when they are in the World Bank or the United Nations, to have forgotten all of that passion. And so we, as a human family, are going to depend on young European students of economics carrying through with ethics, justice, humility, and owning the fact that their own societies have been engaged in extractive economic processes that help to create the problems that we are actually dealing with now. And I think often there is, when you're in conversation between the West and the global majority, there is an expectation or a sort of a sense of arrogance of who has the solutions, as opposed to placing the emphasis on who has caused the problems of late stage capitalism. Where should that sort of concern be located? And I really don't think it should be located in the informal economies of the global majority or the global South, because many of those actors have been surviving. They have had their own lives of integrity, but they have not been the proponents of the mental models that have led to inequality and environmental degradation. So I think I would want to not have a particularly, it would be for the Dutch economic students to embrace feeling discomfort about where we are now and going forward to help to change that, working with the human family across the planet. Thanks.
Thank you. Gabriela, for you, the very last closing statements of this session.
Well, much more in the direction of my colleagues. No? First of all, we are responsible for the future, the North and the Global South, both together. No? In the case of Latin America, we need national strategies of development. And if I were talking to the Latin American people, I would say young people must contribute to generate these new strategies and also to generate the consensus to base these strategies. But in general, all over the world, we need economists with a much more open mind, no? Because it is not just the economist, it does not only handle numbers, No, as Jigar said, there is a strong interaction between economics and politics. So it is needed a very broad sensitivity on what society is and what are the needs of the society. No? The disruptive technologies are here, and they arrived, and they are going to be here, and we have to learn how to deal with them and how to introduce them into our life, no? But in the case of Latin America, for instance, that we have a strong inequality and heterogeneity, we need policies that induce a development process that stimulate these new technologies, but avoid this negative effect of this technology. And this is not just a problem of Latin America, because these threats of the disruptive technologies is a problem that we have all over the world. And science, technology, and innovation policy can contribute in that direction or not. If there is a very linear approach is adopted, this is guided only to productivity, growth. And no, the social dimension is very important, not just for Latin America, for all over the world. So we have to think in all these consequences of the disruptive technologies and try to deal with them in a way that contribute to a better world. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's a beautiful way to close today's interview. I want to thank each of you for your time. I learned a lot. I thought it was really, really interesting. Thank you.